Thank you for joining Stanford Social Innovation Review's webinar, Collective Impact, Embracing Emergence. It's the latest in our series of webinars called SSIR Live. I'm Eric Nee, Managing Editor of the Stanford Social Innovation Review and moderator of today's webinar. Stanford Social Innovation Review is published at the Center for Philanthropy and Civil Society at Stanford University. We launched SSIR Live several years ago to provide a forum for people involved in social innovation to discuss important topics. We host new webinars about once a month, choosing topics from among Stanford Social Innovation Review's most popular and important articles. So keep your eyes open for our upcoming webinars. We also encourage you to tweet and bring others into the conversation during this webinar by using the hashtags SSIR Live and Collective Impact. Thank you very much for joining us today. Before getting started, I want to go over a few housekeeping items. If you're having any trouble with sound, click on the refresh button on the left-hand side of your screen. For any technical difficulties, you can click on the help button in the top right-hand corner. The webinar will last 1 hour. The first 30 or so minutes will be a presentation by our 3 featured speakers, followed by about 25 minutes for questions and answers. Please submit your question by keying it into the box on the bottom left corner of your screen. Your question is anonymous. The webinar will be accessible 3 hours from now by clicking on the same link you used today. You can freely access the webinar as many times as you'd like over the next year. You can download the slides now or at any time in the future. Next slide, please. Collective impact, when nonprofits, governments, businesses, and the public are brought together around a common agenda to focus on a specific social problem, has been enthusiastically embraced by organizations around the world. However, many people pursuing collective impact have become frustrated with their inability to make progress tackling complex social problems. One of the reasons for this is that they have not had the knowledge or the tools to deal with complexity. We are fortunate to have 3 experts with us today who are going to talk about how to create an intentional process that can help you develop effective solutions in a complex and continually evolving environment. John Kania, Managing Partner at FSG and co-author of the SSI article, Embracing Emergence, How Collective Impact Addresses Complexity, will discuss the concept of emergence, a term that describes events that are unpredictable and which no single organization or individual can control. He'll be followed by Blair Taylor, President of Memphis Tomorrow, who will talk about the role that complexity and emergence has played in her collective impact work in Memphis. Last, Mark Kabaj, an associate with Tamarack Institute, will talk about developmental evaluation, how it is different from other types of evaluation, and the important role that it plays in collective impact efforts. Before I turn it over to John, I'd like to remind you again to join the conversation by tweeting using the hashtags SSIR Live or Collective Impact. Now let me turn things over to John, who will begin the presentation.
Thanks very much, Eric. Next slide, please. Well, hello, everyone. Since we published our first article on collective impact in the winter 2011 edition of Stanford Social Innovation Review, enthusiasm continues to grow about collective impact as an approach to bringing about large-scale social progress. In some respects, the initial article served as a clarion call to many who work in the sector who embrace the core premise of the initial article, which is this: that to achieve large-scale change against our serious social and environmental problems, we need to approach things very differently than we often do today. We need to move beyond working in isolated ways as individual organizations pursuing single-point interventions to working collectively to align and coordinate multiple efforts and interventions against clearly defined goals. And yet we find that many who have embraced the idea of collective impact still struggle with how to get it done. Of course, a key challenge of this work is that while the 5 conditions for collective impact, and we list them on this slide, make intuitive sense to folks and in and of themselves seem like reasonably simple concepts, the work of collective impact is not simple. This work, whether in education, health, community development, the environment, or other areas where we're attempting to make societal progress, this work is quite complex. Now, we throw the word complexity around a lot, but we often don't face up to what it means to operate in complex systems. Why is that? Well, because complexity it's complex. Next slide, please. Most of us, even those who might have attended graduate school and received our MBA or our Master's in Public Health or Master's in Public Administration or other impressive master's degrees, were never taught about complexity. However, as we've all gone about our business blissfully unaware and avoiding facing up to complexity, there's been lots of work over the last several decades in the study of complexity in fields like biology, computer science, sociology, and even finance. And interestingly enough, there is fairly universal agreement on the characteristics of complexity, or what are sometimes called complex adaptive systems. Here are several of the most important characteristics of complexity to understand. Complex systems are not predictable. Therefore, it does little good to do detailed planning to the umpteenth iota because your assumptions about what works will change, sometimes very quickly. Complex systems achieve order without central control, so hierarchical structures for doing the work won't work. Complex systems demonstrate the characteristic of emergence. The system evolves through a series or a pattern of interactions that are not predictable in advance, but they're nonetheless identifiable. Complex systems have embedded systems. This is another way of saying that at some level everything is connected to everything. For example, when we refer to juvenile justice reform, we're not just talking about one homogeneous system, but systems nested within systems that include things like law enforcement, probate in the courts, the detention system itself, and intersect with other systems like mental health, education, and child welfare. And finally, complex systems operate through coevolution, which is to say that if you seek to intervene in the system, you need to remember that you yourself are part of that system. To be successful in the system, you'll need to keep evolving and changing your approach and interventions. The system changes in response to not only your interventions, but other events, many of which you don't control. So you'll need to change yourself to be effective, ergo the notion that complexity requires coevolution. Now, for those of us doing the complex work of collective impact, all of these dimensions of complexity are important to unpack and better understand. And at the close of today's presentation, I'll offer further resources for those who want to dive into complexity, which I highly recommend that you do. But our focus today will be on characteristic number 3, emergence, because herein lies one critical way to orient yourself to how to make progress in collective impact efforts, which involve multiple players, multiple interventions, and multiple systems, and are therefore complex. Next slide, please. Emergence is a fancy word used to describe something we see every day all around us. We just don't usually think about it too much, with too much intention or awareness of what's going on. So to help wrap our minds around emergence as a characteristic of complexity that does make sense, let's talk about the notion of evolution in nature. The process of evolution is the process of emergence. As one animal successfully adapts to its environment, others mutate in ways that overcome the advantages the first animal has developed. There's no ultimate solution in evolution beyond the process of continual adaptation within an ever-changing environment and a better evolutionary fit with that environment. What we see with evolution is a biological system evolving through a series of patterns of interactions that are not predictable, but are nonetheless identifiable. Monkey becomes ape, becomes Neanderthal, becomes man. Not predictable in advance, but an identifiable pattern for anybody watching. Next slide, please. With some understanding of complexity and emergence, we can begin to think about the implications of these reality-based concepts for collective impact efforts. In any collective impact effort, we typically begin by developing a common agenda. Another way to think about a common agenda is that it's a process for developing a common strategy or approach to the problem everyone buys into. For instance, what will our collective approach be to reducing poverty, or improving high school graduation rates, or cleaning up a river? But as that common agenda plays out, our plan and approach will necessarily evolve. Strategy guru Henry Mintzberg of Canada captured the evolution of intended strategy as it meets complex realities. He called it Emergence Strategy. The diagram on the left of this slide captures Mintzberg's thinking. Emergence strategy is the view that strategy emerges over time as intentions collide with and accommodate a changing reality. According to Mintzberg, emergent strategy is a set of actions or behaviors consistent over time. It's a realized pattern that was not expressly intended at the outset in the original planning of the strategy. The term emergent implies that an organization is learning what works in practice. They'll learn what parts of their intended strategy went unrealized and what parts of their strategy were emergent, the result of both their actions and the actions of others that lead to a newly realized strategy. And this newly realized strategy will continue to evolve over time, incorporating both aspects of deliberate strategy and aspects of emergent strategy. Now let's think about this concept of emergent strategy not at the organizational level as Mintzberg originally intended it. Think about emergent strategy at the level of collective impact. Considering emergent strategy in the context of collective impact, we can recast collective impact as being about basically two key activities, and this is illustrated on the right side of this slide. The work of collective impact is basically about two things. One, creating a common intent, or in Mintzberg words, creating our intended plan, and two, then structuring our work to identify and take advantage of emergence as it occurs. We are most likely to take advantage of emergence to produce scale outcomes if we can structure the work to enable collective and emergent seeing, learning, and doing. Next slide, please. So I've given you some basic concepts around complexity and emergence. What we want to do now is help you understand how these concepts play out in collective impact efforts. Blair Taylor is going to take you through an example of emergence in action in the context of her collective impact efforts in Memphis. After Blair speaks, we'll shift gears to talk about a key activity in this process that enables those engaged in collective impact efforts to actually spot emergence as it's happening and make sense of emergent patterns through collective seeing, learning, and doing. The specific activity we'll be talking about, which is both an action and an orientation, is called developmental evaluation, also called complexity-based evaluation. And Mark Kabaj will share his wisdom on developmental evaluation. So I'm going to end my introductory comments with a quote from organizational behavior guru Meg Wheatley. We live in a complex world. We often don't know what is going on, and we won't be able to understand its complexity unless we spend more time not knowing. Curiosity is what we need. So as you think about the emergent seeing, learning, and doing that leads to collective impact, keep in mind that the number one quality of leaders who are successful in situations of complexity is not decisiveness, but inquiry. Blair, I'm going to turn it over to you to talk about emergence in action in Memphis, Tennessee.
All right. Thank you, John, and thanks, everybody, for joining us today. Next slide, please. All right, I'm going to use 3 slides here to illustrate emergence in action. And first, I'm going to provide an overview of our Collective Impact Initiative in Memphis, just a brief one. Then I'm going to share the specific example of emergence in action. And then I'm going to wrap up with some observations about the factors that have made our success with emergence possible. So on this first slide here on the left side, you'll see some colored boxes which represent 5 distinct but very interrelated collective impact initiatives in Memphis, starting at the top with one called People First. And all of these are a part of an umbrella collective impact effort in Memphis called Memphis Fast Forward. And that effort is co-convened by our city mayor, our county mayor, and the Business CEOs Association called Memphis Tomorrow, which I manage. On the right side of the slide is a depiction specifically of the People First collective impact effort, which is where my emergence example will come from today. I've plugged People First into one of my favorite John Kania graphics, which shows the collective impact structure, and I just want to spend a minute reviewing it because it's really this structure that allows for the collective seeing, learning, and doing that John just mentioned, which has been so critical to our progress. First thing to note on this graphic is that there's a diverse collection of partners at the table, from education, business, nonprofit, government, and civic sectors, all focused on a common agenda of improving educational outcomes along the cradle-to-career pipeline. They're organized into a governing board, work groups, organizational partners, and community members in such a way as to facilitate their working together in developing and executing action plans around that common agenda. You'll note, too, at the top of the slide where it shows they've established a shared vision, goals, and measurement which really serve as anchors for the overall work of the effort. And then also, if you'll note on the left side of the slide, that their work together is coordinated by a nonprofit, a 501c3 organization, which serves as a backbone organization, or a quarterbacking entity, as we used to call it before John and the FSG team provided us with the new language of collective impact. Next slide, please. So it's become very clear over and over again in our work in Memphis that our collective impact structure and operations have equipped us to be more effective at seizing opportunities as they emerge. And the example I'll share today is from People First, which you now know is our Cradle to Career Collective Impact Initiative. The team, People First team, has developed 4 goals and 10 strategies, one of which is Strategy 8, College Access and Completion, and it includes a special emphasis on low-income adults who had started college at one point but never finished. Sometimes in this context we refer to them as partial completers. And at the table around that particular strategy are our public university, our community college, some human resources leaders from leading companies, some business associations, including our chamber and my organization, our Workforce Investment Act administrative entity, and a local nonprofit program called Graduate Memphis, which is focused on college attainment. So one day last year, the staff leader of the People First Backbone organization discovered that an amendment had been quietly made to our state's Hope Scholarship. Whereas the scholarship had previously been limited to graduating high school seniors, this amendment opened it up to low-income adults with 12 hours of qualifying college credit. So what was so interesting and surprising at the time is that none of our partners knew about the amendment. For whatever reason, it hadn't been publicized, and I'm not sure, honestly, that we would yet have discovered it if not for our People First Backbone leader, who was proactively trolling for policies and programs that could be beneficial to our work. Not surprisingly, though, upon learning about it, we, the team at the table, of course, agreed that it could be a great solution, a key solution, really, in getting low-income partial completers back to college. So then, thanks to the fact that we were already organized and at the table together, we collectively began to consider this new scholarship tool and how to put it to work. 2 challenges emerged. Number one, how do the colleges and university find and then recruit eligible partial completers? Number 2, if interested income-eligible adults wanted to participate but then didn't have the full 12 hours of credit, how do we get the balance of those credit hours paid for? So we at first thought along traditional lines. Maybe someone will give us a grant to pay for the credit hours and maybe fund some nonprofits to do outreach and recruitment. And then we slowly began to realize that as we collectively looked across the diverse partners at the table, there were some existing resources that could solve the problem if we would reconfigure our partnerships and the resources a little differently. So to solve the problems of both recruitment and funding the first 12 hours of credit, solutions emerged from all of our partners for how to use their resources and work together in new ways. The first, our business partners had tuition reimbursement benefits that could pay for the needed credit hours, and they also agreed to promote the benefit with employees as well as to host information sessions on their corporate work sites to be conducted by our university and community college recruiting offices. Our public sector Workforce Investment Act administrative entity, the WIA entity, could pay for the needed credit hours for dislocated workers through a special mechanism that they had in place called ITAs, or individual training accounts, and they agreed that they would promote the offering as part of their ongoing outreach to dislocated workers. Thirdly, our public university and community colleges could deploy their growing offering of what's called experiential learning credits as a solution to building college credits. And thanks to our corporate partners, they could also expand their recruitment to corporate campuses, as I've mentioned, and begin to promote the scholarship opportunity also through their regular outreach. And then a local nonprofit who was at the table with us, Graduate Memphis, agreed not only to be able to promote the scholarship opportunity, but really important to the effort, they had the capability and agreed to handle the tracking of a pilot cohort of students so that we could monitor and measure the impact of the new partnerships on our desired outcomes. And then lastly, our State of Tennessee Higher Education Commission helped us better understand the nuances and flexibilities in the policy, and they agreed to be a partner in the work group participating with us to think about policy effectiveness and adding value as perhaps other opportunities would emerge. Next slide. So wrapping this up and quickly reviewing what made it possible for all of these partners and resources to be leveraged in a new way and to take advantage of a newly emerged opportunity. There were some key enablers first that made this possible, really, that have to do with our collective impact structure, which facilitates, again, our collective seeing, learning, and doing. That structure enabled us to already have in place an existing formalized collaboration with stakeholders at the table from multiple sectors. It also meant that we had collective goals, strategies, and metrics already in place that we were familiar with and rallying around together. And we had a backbone organization guiding us towards new opportunities and solutions. And then secondly, there were some key factors that really strengthened our readiness. Beyond just having that structure in place, these factors, the first, that we had really begun to cultivate an understanding and to condition our partners and stakeholders to think of People First as a forum where they can plug in new opportunities and participate in creative problem solving around them. And a second key strengthening factor is that we've been working to build a culture or a collective habit, if you will, of systematically looking across multiple partners for new opportunities and ways to achieve shared goals. And then thirdly and lastly, that so often the solution is just sort of let's get a grant, let's see if we can raise some money for this new program or opportunity, but instead the fact that we encourage cost-neutral solutions and resource sharing first really has pushed us to be, I think, more creative and more thorough, looking beyond our own individual walls for solutions, and frankly helps build our credibility with funders for future initiatives. So, of course, none of this is easy. None of this just happens automatically. It really does, as John had pointed out, takes an intentionality from the leadership. And first and foremost of importance is having that structure in place, and then talking about it and practicing these things in our work groups and teams really, builds the understanding, the habits, and also the enthusiasm for how this methodology can boost success. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mark, who's going to talk with us about how we evaluate and how we can use evaluation to strengthen this kind of work. Mark?
Thanks, Blair, and thanks, John. Good afternoon, everyone. My task is to briefly highlight one of the implications of emergence and complexity for the practice of evaluation, and specifically I have about 10 minutes and 4 slides to touch upon the concept of developmental evaluation, which is a phrase coined by Michael Quinn Patton, one of North America's foremost evaluators in the early 1990s, and more recently elaborated on extensively in his book with the same name. It's a pretty exciting topic. I get excited by it, though it's somewhat layered, and I know that I'm just going to give you an appetizer at best, and hopefully you're encouraged, if you're not already in the game of DE, to explore some of the resources at the end of the presentation. Let me begin by saying a few words about our experience with DE, and it's something we came across in the years of 2002 to 2004 when we were in the early days of a national partnership of 15 urban collaboratives from across Canada whose shared aim was to reduce poverty in their community. We called that at the time a multi-sectoral comprehensive community initiative, and today, thanks to the elegant writing of FSG, we would just simply call it a collective impact initiative. It was a good time. We had a terrific policy institute and an evaluation group on board to assist the groups develop really robust evaluation plans. However, despite their best efforts and several years of effort, people struggled to come up with what they felt were helpful evaluation designs. I remember those days quite painfully because I was complicit in all of this. And some of the quotes that come to mind were one person describing the evaluation design process as trying to drive a parked bus, and another mentioned that the moment the evaluation folks came into the room, the oxygen left. And the main reason, and there was a couple of them, but the main reason we think there was such friction was the friction between the expectations and practice of traditional evaluation and the reality of collective efforts to tackle complex issues. Simply, the evaluators wanted clear goals and crisp measures of progress, as well as well-conceptualized strategy, and we and funders and sponsors wanted the same things. But we found time and time again that we ran into the same pattern. People spent a lot of time gathering data in the search for certainty that John had talked about earlier, but it never seemed to be enough. It was a process of ready, ready, aim, aim, ready, 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 but no fire. People tended to get overwhelmed with developing the comprehensive plans, and no sooner did they come up with one that the context shifted and the plan was no longer relevant. They call this strategic decay in the business world, and the process of strategic decay for plans is really amplified in fast-moving community environments. And finally, once groups started intervening into systems, they generated ripple effects that they did not anticipate, and they created new opportunities and new challenges that they hadn't thought of in the planning process. In fact, we found that most community groups, given their preference, wanted to develop some aspirational goals and some umbrella strategies that provided a container for action, possibly with a starting point portfolio of strategies or initiatives, and wanted to do the rest in the field. And as one CEO of one of the collaborations told me, they don't want to think in the boardroom, people want to think with their hands. This is where DE came into the picture, and we realized that we needed a new way to introduce evaluative processes into the work, but felt a gap in evaluation practice. And here's why. The theory and practice of traditional evaluation is largely organized around two purposes. These are formative evaluation, which is useful when the intervention is stabilizing and the stewards need new data to improve or refine the strategy. And this is really the area of Six Sigma, total quality management, continuous improvement. Summative evaluation is when the intervention is well established and stabilized, and the stewards of the intervention need data to judge its merit or worth, to decide whether or not the strategy should be discontinued, continued, or scaled up. This is the area of external evaluators, big evaluation projects, and sometimes really elaborate evaluation designs like randomized controlled trials. But there's a niche for evaluation that is called DE, and this is where the intervention is still not fully developed. There is no it to improve or to judge. It's not fully conceptualized. Why? Because it's still developing. And the aim of DE, therefore, is to help the social innovators change or develop a strategy in a way that provides them real-time feedback and disciplined sense-making as they go about their emergent work. This creation of a space for DE is absolutely critical, because when traditional evaluation activities are employed for still emerging interventions, which are the course for dealing with complex issues, the premature emphasis and overly detailed, too rigid conceptualizations of outcomes and measures can actually handicap the development process. And in fact, Michael Quinn Patton and his colleagues noted in their terrific book called Getting to Maybe, traditional evaluation can actually become the enemy of innovation and community change. So how does DE play out in practice? I'm going to touch on 5 key differences between the two. And just to keep you on your toes, I'm going to walk through the list from the bottom up. The first point is the longest one, and the next 4 are relatively brief, and then I'll move to a real quick anecdote about how this all plays out in practice. The first so change slides, please. The first distinction to note is the lens that evaluators and change makers bring to their work. In a traditional evaluation, we tend to favor relatively linear cause and effect models, often captured in the form of a logic model, which says if we do what we said in this plan, it should yield these effects, and that will contribute to improvement in some level of population needles that we're trying to move. Logic models are great when they're relatively discrete interventions, like vaccination campaigns, where you might be dealing with a few well-understood influenceable variables. And these actually, most collective impact initiatives will at least have some of these activities in their portfolio. But logic models don't handle the complexity of community change efforts. And anyone knows that has worked with complex issues that if you are in the game of changing a pattern of outcomes, you are in the game of changing systems. I'm actually going to jump to the next one quickly just because of time. The second point is around accountability. Whereas traditional evaluation focuses on holding the stewards of a community change effort to account for the success or the failure of their plans, developmental evaluation is embedded in the idea that you can influence the variables that yield these outcomes, but you can't always control them. Accountability instead means paying attention to what's going on, what's working and what's not, and shifting to respond strategically. It is unaccountable, for example, to stick to rigid and elegant plans if your learning and context tells you they're no longer relevant. The third distinction lies in the role of the evaluator. And in traditional evaluation, the evaluator is often someone from the outside of the organization in an effort to get an external perspective on the whole affair. It's very clumsy and unhelpful in fast-moving contexts where change makers need real-time assistance to make sense of their little probes and the fast-moving context. They need real-time assistance with evaluation feedback. The fourth and final distinction are fairly straightforward. The fourth one is how evaluators and change makers approach goals and measures. And in traditional evaluation, the emphasis is on establishing a baseline and watching progress towards moving the needle on that baseline. In DE, the evaluator works with the change makers to adapt or change the evaluation mechanisms and measures to reflect the changes in goals. If strategies have a half-life or experience strategic decay, so should the evaluation mechanisms. If evaluation is going to remain relevant, it has to keep up to the evolving strategy. The fifth and final difference is, once again, the purpose distinction. There are lots of summative moments in developmental evaluation where one has to make decisions about should we continue or not continue. But the major emphasis is on using evaluative feedback to help inform or affirm changes in direction in fast-moving emergent environments. I hope these distinctions are helpful, and they're sharper on paper than they are in practice. Let me simply touch on a few points on a case study to illustrate how they have played out in several of the practices that we've seen. And I'll ask you to turn to the second last slide and confirm that several years ago in northern Alberta in a city called Edmonton of about 1.2 million people, a group developed an umbrella strategy to dramatically reduce poverty. And their strategy was fairly simple and distinct. They wanted to work on the working poor, who comprised 50% of the low-income families in the city, and wanted to reduce that number. They were keen on framing their challenge as family economic success and assisting 1,000 families achieve that success. And their strategy or theory of change was to incubate programs, services, or products, preferably across sectors that move the needles in these areas. They considered that their umbrella strategy, and they unfolded it. And as they unfolded it, some of the things emerged as Mintzberg anticipated would emerge for any emergent strategy. They realized some of the things, some of the things they didn't realize, and some of the things were emergent. One of their incubating strategies was to generate a Make Tax Time Pay initiative, which mobilized scores of nonprofits and agencies to improve the uptake of low-income residents on 17 income support programs. That was a terrific success, unfolded as planned, and it got spun off to a larger NGO that runs the process to this day. Some things were not realized. The economy shifted so quickly in northern Alberta that, thanks to the rapid expansion of the oil sands, that wages went up and housing prices went up dramatically, and they found they could no longer add value to the issues of improving access to housing and dealing with living wages because it wasn't an issue any longer. And finally, and lastly, some of the group strategy was pure emergent. Their varied experiences with working with people on the structural reasons for poverty prompted them to spend a lot more time on policies and systems changes and made them realize that if they were to get leverage on moving the needles for outcomes, they were going to have to get into the game of systems change. You have in that last part of the slide a description of their new emerging strategy, and you'll note that some of the things remain the same, but this is a great example of is a radical redesign of their umbrella strategy that is really much more ambitious than the one they started with. They wanted to create workforce development systems for the entire city at the end of this. My time is up, and I wanted to give you a taste of how DE played out in practice. If you're not familiar with this idea in practice, you can go to the last slide, where we've highlighted 6 different resources on the topic. This includes an excellent resource by Holly Press-Gill, John's colleague at FSG, and Tanya Bell from the Center for Evaluation Innovation. I encourage you to read these if you're interested in the world of DE, and simply to know that if you jump into the world of DE, just as our understanding is growing around how to navigate complex issues, so is our understanding of how to evaluate our efforts to address them. Thanks so much, and back to you.
Great. Thanks, Mark. Well, first of all, this is John Kenya. I want to congratulate both Mark and Blair on talking about very complex, nuanced material in a very short period of time and doing it with great clarity. I think what you hear in both Blair's example of emergence in action and Mark's example of a way that we can actually actively observe and take advantage of emergence in action through developmental evaluation. Sort of a scenario where we are being predetermined in our process and our structure, i.e. the 5 conditions of collective impact and employing something like developmental evaluation. And yet we're watching for emergent solutions. And I want to contrast that with the way most of us think the sector should work, the social sector should work, where we're thinking typically about coming up with a solution and predetermining the solution and then allowing the process and the structure to emerge. And that's a key distinction that we want to make here. In situations of complexity, we want to be intentional in our goals and we want to be intentional in our process and structure, but we also want to watch and take advantage of the situation as it evolved. And again, both Mark and Blair gave us different windows into that. I'm just going to flip to the last slide. I think it's actually already up there, resources on complexity. For those of you who are more interested in learning more about complexity, and it is a complex topic, here are some resources. I'm going to turn it back to Eric right now, who will address questions.
Thank you very much, John, and thank you, Blair and Mark, for your really fascinating presentations. Next slide, please. So for the next 25 minutes, it's time for you to ask questions. If you have a question, please submit it by keying the question into the box on the bottom left corner of your screen. I'm reading those, and I will be relaying them to our presenters. Unfortunately, we won't have time to field everybody's questions, but we will get to as many as we can. Let me start off with you, John. You wrote your first, you were a co-author of the first article on collective impact, and you've subsequently written a couple other follow-on pieces, this being the latest. So in kind of the spirit of emergence and continual learning, could you tell me what are the important differences between the model that you laid out originally and what it is that you're talking about today, and why, what led to those changes? What were you seeing and what were you hearing that caused you to refine your model?
Yeah, Eric, it's an important set of questions, and I alluded to this earlier, but this is a great opportunity to sort of hammer that point home. Part of the motivation in getting out this new article on collective impact, which we called Embracing Emergence, was a concern that many were interpreting our first article on collective impact as a prescriptive recipe for social change. We laid out in the first article, a set of conditions for large-scale change, 5 key conditions, and the more we do this work, the more convinced we are that these are critical key conditions for making progress in complexity. They're critical conditions to put in place to enable a complex web of cross-sector actors to align and coordinate their efforts behind a clear goal. But what's important to recognize, and this again was part of the motivation to getting, sort of going there in complexity, is that there is no solution inherent in the 5 conditions themselves. When collective impact is successful, it's not prescriptive on solutions, it's specific on process, and structure. So the process and structure around the 5 conditions doesn't allow us to predict any answer to our complex problems in advance, and Blair gave you some, a great example of some solutions emerging that they never could have predicted in advance, and stakeholders being able to take advantage of those and develop derivative solutions. You couldn't predict that in advance. So collective impact doesn't allow you to predict answers, but it does, through the 5 conditions, allow us to see answers as they emerge and capitalize on them at scale. So those are sort of the key distinctions we wanted to make, that the 5 conditions are definitely critical for achieving large-scale change, but they're not about creating a formula. They're about creating a process and a structure that leads to solutions.
Blair, I wonder if you might add to that. The work that you've been doing kind of predated, I think, the whole collective impact model that FSG articulated. Did you see that same kind of evolution in your work?
We have seen unbelievable evolution in our work. We've been at this for about 7 years, and it has really changed and evolved pretty substantially. I'm looking at these questions right now that are coming in, and I'm seeing we have a lot of nuts and bolts people who want some nuts and bolts answers. So I'll try to respond in a way that offers that. One of the things that I think you run the risk of is that people become sort of frustrated at the constant revisiting of topics and programs. We started off thinking, okay, we're a part of putting a plan in place. Let's just work that plan. Let's stick with that plan, and then let's revisit it in a few years and see how we have done, and then maybe at that point we refresh. But the truth is that we've evolved to sort of a regular refreshing, and I think how we can adjust attitudes about that is that if we frame it as the sort of constant revisiting as a process of continuous improvement, that's something everybody understands and appreciate as a best business practice and organizational practice. And we have with Memphis Fast Forward and People First being our specific example here, have set some expectations of continuous improvement by formalizing it as a part of the work. So specifically, we've put in place with all of our initiatives something that we call an initiative action plan, or an IAP, which is the work plan on which the progress is reported each quarter and which partners update regularly at a minimum each year, but with the expectation that things change, new opportunities come along, and that things don't work or work better than we thought. Requires a lot of communication, but we have team meetings specifically based around those IAPs to jointly problem solve and to sort of replan and refresh as needed.
John, let me ask you another question. You make a distinction between complex problems and simple ones, but in reality, aren't even what appear to be simple problems really complex ones? I mean, I think an example is given of vaccinations or treatments for medical ailments where one can generally assume that the treatment is going to go as prescribed. But, doctors, one of the reasons you have a doctor, not a untrained person, is that they have to deal with unexpected situations about side effects, about misdiagnosis. And I think that's, any social problem I've seen, there's never as simple as it sounds. So aren't all problems really complex problems, or or can you draw a line that distinguishes them and is helpful for our audience?
Sure. So you're right. Virtually all social problems are complex to varying degrees, and complex problems also have simple problems nested within them. So let's stick with the doctor metaphor. So with simple problems, the outcome's predictable. If, for example, a doctor prescribes medication for high blood pressure and the patient takes the medication in the right dosage, it's pretty predictable that the patient's blood pressure will go down. That's a simple problem. Complex problems occur when multiple relationships and multiple interventions are involved, making the outcome much less predictable. So if the doctor were to prescribe healthy exercise and healthy eating instead of medication, then the diagnosis and the solution might still be appropriate. But let's say the patient doesn't follow the doctor's advice at all, or he might exercise but still eat really unhealthy food. So then the doctor's intended strategy didn't work. So the doctor needs to evolve the strategy to match the new condition. So maybe the doctor sternly threatens the patient with the prospect of a heart attack if he doesn't both eat right and exercise. It's a new strategy that might work, but it also might not, depending on how the patient reacts to the threat of a heart attack. So the doctor has to watch and see what happens and recalibrate his solution accordingly. So yes, in complex situations, taking an emergent strategy approach is pretty universally appropriate, whether it's for an individual or an organization, or for what we're talking about here, the case of a collective, a set of collective players pursuing collective impact.
Blair, let me ask you a question about the example that you gave. It sounded very smooth, the way that that people saw this new opportunity, the State Hope Scholarship, and you talked about it. You found ways that the organizations could tie into that, and it worked out. But maybe it did go that smoothly. But if it did, there must be examples of things that didn't go so smoothly. And I'm wondering if you could talk about a little bit about the difficulty of getting, all these disparate organizations to be willing to rethink what they are doing, to adapt. Because as we know, organizations have their own funders, their own agendas, their own constituencies besides what's in this group. And it must be hard to get this to really happen.
Yes, it is hard to get this to happen, and you're right. It was not near as smooth as perhaps I made it sound. In fact, with this particular example, it took us forever. So it took us probably 6 months to sort of figure out the solutions that we ultimately came up with from the time that we heard about the new opportunity. There was a lot of enthusiasm around first hearing about the scholarship program change, and we pulled together a couple of meetings, but to be perfectly honest with you, we didn't, at those meetings, they were sort of part of us at those meetings, and not all of the folks who were ultimately part of the solution that were at those meetings. So we really did get stuck thinking about, well, the solution is to go get a grant and get funding. And then I was sort of in a role of, okay, well, let me think about if there are any, potential funders for this and any doors I could open, if any of our foundations or corporate leaders or who might be interested in something like this, maybe our state. We sort of had some conversations with our state about maybe they would be willing to sort of fund something as a pilot to test out the policy. And we sort of flopped around a bit for about 6 months, and then really it was an aha, just through a series of conversations that I had with a couple of our HR leaders who were at the table around tuition reimbursement. And then the WIA, I saw someone ask, what's the WIA? That's the Federal Workforce Investment Act. Each county has a program that runs federal funds through the state, then to the county for workforce training. And they were at our table, although not in those meetings at first. So they were on the sort of governing board, and they were in different work groups around workforce development, but they weren't originally a part of that conversation about college access. And so it was really kind of, I would say it's because of the structure that we did ultimately have those conversations, but it took us a while to sort of pull everybody together and get the thinking organized and to sort of realize the opportunities and the resources that we all had and how those might come together. Messy.
John, have you've seen a lot of collective impact efforts. Does that sound familiar?
Yeah, messy is a word that's used a lot. One of the questions that came up here, and I think it relates to the situation or the example that Blair gave. One of the questions is, how do you sort of balance taking advantage, being flexible and taking advantage of emergence with being disciplined enough to stay focused on your goals. And Blair's example is a good one in that the overall goal, sometimes the goals do change. Sometimes you get the goals wrong at the outset. But in Blair's situation, the overall goal of college access, and particularly for those who hadn't completed, never changed. What changed was somebody, finding the availability of these scholarships that nobody had basically been overlooked, and then a set of players coming together and contributing new solutions based on that new data. And I think that's the way this happens. So it's being clear-eyed on your intentions and your goals, but being definitely being flexible and watching out for what's going on through things, through the sort of messy the messy scenario that Blair talked about, which is fairly, usual, or being even more intentional in the watching, the observation through intentionally using processes and approaches like developmental evaluation.
Mark, let me ask you a couple questions about developmental evaluations. Given that these are complex problems that are, inherently chaotic and changing, I guess, I won't say forever, but for extended periods of times, how do you know when is this a new type of evaluation that basically replaces formative or summative, or does there come a moment when one can employ those types of evaluations, and how do you know when that is?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks. Good question, and one I wanted to had addressed in that Edmonton case study. One of the ways to think about evaluation is what is the nature of the context or niche in which evaluative feedback is required. And if you look at most community change efforts, they manifest something some people called patch dynamics. Some parts of the model or the strategy are well developed and are requiring more traditional forms of summative evaluation. You can have a early childhood development program where you're testing out a new version of Head Start, and you want to scale that program up if it deserves scaling, and you might employ fairly traditional evaluation methods, including randomized controlled trials, et cetera. And so there's some summative context in a change initiative. There could be formative ones where you're building new processes or models or ways of working together, and you need constant feedback on improvement. And some of the effort might be continually developmental. Things are starting off or needing to radically adapt all the time to respond to emergence and new learnings and insights. I don't know this to be true, but my rule of thumb is if you're involved in a community change effort, you may have patch dynamics. You may have different kinds of work needing different kinds of feedback. But I tend to think the general pattern is most complex change initiatives are continuously developmental. From a bird's eye view, they are almost always adapting and evolving over time, even if certain moments or pieces of them are more stable and requiring more traditional parts of evaluation, or approaches to evaluation.
So Blair, have you employed this type of evaluation in Memphis?
I would love to say that we have done that just right, but we certainly have I would say done elements of it. I think I referenced earlier that we've put in place a sort of a method of sort of ongoing evaluation and review of our work together. We center that or anchor that in what we call our initiative action plans that are kind of, we have a process by which the partners involved in those initiatives are reviewing them quarterly and updating, this has worked or we're behind on this, and problem solving the work. And then we have a reporting out structure to our sort of broader governing board, which, allows for sort of even greater input into, okay, is this really working for us, or is this something that we may want to, may need to come up with some different solutions for, or maybe a different direction. So we do it, and I think we could do it better.
Mark, did you want to add something to that?
Yeah, no, thanks, Blair. I actually think most people and most change efforts are using some version of DE, but what has happened is since we haven't really had a niche for it and haven't been explicit about how one would be robust and systematic in a developmental context with evaluation, I don't think we necessarily privilege it as much or shine a light on it. So, Blair, just as you were talking, I was just musing of how you're constantly using data and sense-making processes to help you make mid-course adjustments. And DE is meant, quite frankly, to help the innovators think better by bringing data to the discussions. And this is where it differs from strategists and organizational development people who are good strategy makers but may not always have the skills and the just-in-time ability to say, oh, you need some rapid feedback on that and you need to make sense of this data. That's my job. So I do think most processes naturally do this. We may need in our entire field to just strengthen that in-house capacity to do it a little bit better. But I don't think this is unnatural for any change initiative.
Great point.
So, John, you have a window at FSG also to funders and foundations. I'm curious to what extent you find that funders understand this process, have bought into it. How difficult is it for an organization, for example, to communicate to their funder that, well, we have an emergent approach here. We think it's going to go this direction, but it might go this direction. In fact, we're going to change. And then at the end of the year when they do their report, turns out they've gone in a very different direction than what they had originally said they were going to do and gotten the money for. What is that dynamic there, and how do you see this? How can people best communicate to funders that this might be a new approach?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, so fine, you sort of get and believe and understand emergence. Then you show up at a funder and say, we're all for emergence. And they're like, what? And of course, there are many sophisticated folks within the funding community that think about complexity and systems change, and what we are talking about here is systems level change. And many funders do think about that, but they rightfully so are looking to see when they give grants that though their partners who they give grants to can articulate progress they've made against their goals. I think what is important in thinking about emergence and complexity is that we want to be clear and we should be held accountable for progress towards our goals. What we want to see is perhaps greater flexibility on the funder's part in how we achieve those goals. And we want to be able to collect data, and developmental evaluation is an orientation that is about collecting data, both quantitative and qualitative, to determine if and when we should be changing our approaches to those goals and whether or not the indicators that we've selected, as Mark said earlier, are the appropriate ways to measure progress against goals. I think a lot of times, even the indicators you select out of the box to make progress against complex problems probably do need to change. And so I think what we're suggesting is not that if you take an emergent approach, you show up to the funder and say, don't hold us accountable for goals. We do think it's important to demonstrate progress against goals, but also be able to articulate to funders when the approach needs to change based on different dynamics that you're seeing, and when sometimes even the ways that you measure success towards the goal change. And that requires a greater level of dialogue between grantees and funders, and in some instances that's happening. We think it needs to happen more.
Let me just pose that last question to the three of you, because unfortunately we're closing in on the hour. What are the key things that you can tell our listeners that would help them employ this approach successfully? What are the one or two things that are really central to making this a success? Let me start with Mark, and then we'll go to Blair, and then last John.
Sure. I'll riff off of something that John said earlier. A phrase that comes to my mind around the metaphor we have in our mind about how communities work and how we solve complex issues, and we really have this sort of machine metaphor or this recipe metaphor in our head, and it's extraordinarily hard to break. For me, it would be let go of the pretense of certainty and the delusion of control around moving the needle on complex issues, and as John noted, get curious fast, because what you think the nature of the problems are and how to address them, all it is in most community change efforts is a big opening working hypothesis that you are going to test and upgrade continuously, and evaluation is nothing more except reality testing. You got an idea about what the problem is and how to change it, get curious about that process of better understanding it and learning how to address it over time.
Blair?
Okay. Well, I think obviously I think having the structure in place is just absolutely critical. And then there's the building of the habits and the practice of the work. It doesn't just happen that most people get it, and so I just at the onset, and I think what's really important to realize is that you may not be able to throw it all into place and get all the parts moving together and properly at once, but to the extent that you can demonstrate how it can work, with sort of one work team at a time or one project at a time, I think that can build the momentum, kind of build the confidence among your participants and partners that their time is being used well, and that will then help sort of expand overall the support and participation in the work.
And John, why don't you wrap it up?
Yeah, sure. So I guess building on Blair and Mark, what I would say is that if this makes sense to you, because what we're talking here about is reality-based. This is the way the world works. It is not simple. If this makes sense to you, have the confidence to learn more about it and be more comfortable in this uncomfortable place called complexity. This does not mean that you're not rigorous. In fact, this demands greater rigor, just a different type of rigor, and one that most people haven't been educated to. And so learn your way into this, because this is the way the world works. I just wanted to mention briefly to folks that FSG is going to be partnering with the Aspen Institute and a number of other organizations to launch what we're calling the Collective Impact Forum. And the forum is going to be devoted to creating knowledge networks and tools that accelerate the adoption of collective impact. So I wanted to let people know that that's coming. We'll share more on this as plans develop.
Well, thank you, everyone, for sending in such great questions. I'm sorry we didn't have time to get to them all. And thank you, John, Blair, and Mark, for such a terrific presentation. Next slide, please. Thank you very much again for joining us. Please fill out the survey that will appear when you exit this presentation. Again, you can access this webinar as many times as you want over the next 12 months. If you would like a copy of the slide presentation, and I know many of you do, given the questions you posed, they are available for free. Simply click on the drop-down menu located below the photographs of the speakers. If you haven't already read John's article, Embracing Emergence, How Collective Impact Addresses Complexity, you can find it for free on the SSIR website. Our next webinar on Tuesday, June 4th, will be about donor collaborations. To learn about future webinars, sign up at our website for SSIR's free email newsletter. Thank you again for participating.